Hi, welcome to BAL, Building Athletic Lifestyles. I'm Neil. This is the second part of the nutrition fundamentals. If you missed the first part, there is a link down below. You can find that video there. Today we're going to dive a little bit more into how you manipulate your nutrition itself in order to achieve your specific goal. And I say that because it is, like we mentioned last time in that first episode, it is specific to the goal you're trying to achieve, how you then adjust your nutrition for it. Just before we jump into any of those specific options themselves, one thing I want to preface this with is that most diets, most nutrition changes should be made in a sustainable way. It's something that you can maintain and you can keep progressing as you go forwards. It's not about quick fixes, it's not about desperately trying to get to somewhere by next week or something like that. It's about we're in for the long haul here, thinking about finding a position where you can sustain it for years, not just weeks. That said, like anything, there is always a few exceptions. If you need to lose a lot of weight ahead of an operation or something like that, where you've got a specific guideline, or if you need to shed weight before a fight, or if you're a jockey, you need to hit a certain weight, anything like that, then you can be a touch more aggressive with that timeline. So just to cover those four most common aims, it's your overall health, your maintenance of your current position, fat loss, and then also muscle gain as well. We're going to work through them one by one just to make sure we cover them all. I'll leave a few timestamps down here, so if there's a specific one you want to look at, you can jump straight to that. First one, overall health. A few key factors here is that, again, it should be sustainable. We're thinking about the marathon here, not the sprint. So first protocol is eliminating any nutrient deficiencies, making sure that we're covering all bases in terms of our vitamins and minerals. So a real common one here in the UK is that actually you'll be lacking in vitamin D just because we don't get as much sun and we're not very efficient at absorbing it from our food, our nutrition ourselves. So finding ways where you can eliminate those deficiencies is quite important for making sure that you keep yourself healthy in the long run. A good way of actually making sure you cover a lot of those bases sort of comes down into the next 2 points here, which is trying to eat a wide variety of foods. So making sure that you're eating a variety of meats, nuts, multi-pigment veg, things like that, where you get a broad scope. It means that you're generally going to hit a lot of those different nutrient sources along the way. Also trying to eat more whole foods as well, so that's things that are living essentially. So your plants are the most common ones that people look at with these. So making sure that you're eating fresh veg, even if you can't actually afford fresh veg and you have to buy frozen. It's still quite nutrient dense because they tend to freeze it very soon after picking it. In terms of the meats as well, try to eat as little processed meat as possible. The less it's processed, the less it's refined, the more nutrient dense it tends to be. Particularly with health and making it sustainable, thinking about that long-term goal, it should be quite intuitive. It should be something that you can sustain and manipulate as you go forwards. So a good way of thinking about that, a rule that I've found work quite well with a number of my clients, is the 80-20 rule. That's 80% of your food being those whole foods, varied foods, and then 20% being those little luxuries you let sneak in here. A couple of beers at the weekend, maybe a bit of chocolate. 20% you're allowed those little luxuries, whatever it may be. I'll just pop up a little picture here as well of how that actually looks in a week, just to give you a rough idea of what that actually looks like, that 80-20 rule, because it's actually quite important that you can sustain this in the long run. If you go completely Spartan and cut everything out, you're actually quite likely then to have a moment where you binge because there's cravings, you're missing out on what you're thinking. Whereas if you just let yourself have a little bit here and there, actually you're quite likely to curb those cravings, and overall you're probably going to be in a more healthy position. Last protocol on the health is just making sure you've got sufficient water. We've got a really good feedback loop naturally. If you're thirsty, drink. Also making sure that we're trying to drink actual water, fizzy drinks, things like that. It comes with a lot else as well as just the liquid itself. So trying to make sure that you can find a way to retain just the water itself. Perfect. And then jumping into now the management of particularly weight itself here. So this is looking at maintenance, fat loss and muscle gain. We're just going to quickly recap what we went through at the end of the first video, which is we've got my information up here in terms of the example weights that we used, which is myself. And then we got the BMR that we calculated from that. From that we then calculated my TDEE, which we use the Catch-McArdle multipliers. That's just because actually calculating the thermic effect of food and the thermic effect of activity is quite inaccurate, and it's also way more hassle than I'm willing to put in. It doesn't need to be that specific for someone like me. I'm not an elite athlete. I also don't have a particular weight goal that I have to be bang on the money for. So we use the multipliers to get a benchmark to work off of from there. And I'll put the multipliers down here as well so that you can have a little look at those. It's about picking the one that's appropriate to you and keeping it consistent to your lifestyle as you go through and as that evolves. So from that we figured out that I was on roughly maintenance. If I wanted to stay around the same weight, I want to be hitting about 3,100 calories. Again, that's kilocalories like we mentioned in the first video as well. So the main reason you might need to be maintaining where you're currently at is if weight is tied to your career in any way. So think boxers, jockeys, actually a little bit windsurfers as well, where your weight will affect the kit you're using, and I'm sure there's many others as well. Actually, what becomes the most poignant part of this is actually the training you're doing, and then adjusting your nutrition around how you're training. If you suddenly increase your activity, you suddenly start working and training a lot more, you need to adjust your nutrition in line with that as well, and it more becomes just about matching the two as they fluctuate through your life. Fat loss, huge one here, massive topic. If you go anywhere on Google, I'm sure you'll find a lot of information about it. This is one we tend to get hung up on the sexy stuff a lot and actually miss some of those fundamentals, the basics, which is why I want to make this video as well. So one statement that's quite widely accepted through the literature is that the energy balance is the biggest determinant of whether you'll gain or you'll lose weight. So that comes down to your calories in versus your calories out. Nice and simple, if you're looking to lose weight, you need to be in a calorie deficit. You need to be burning more calories than you are taking in. Yeah? Some people will say that this is slightly oversimplified because yes, there are inaccuracies in terms of measuring your calories, but also calorie is not a calorie, which don't get me wrong, I completely agree with, but it actually doesn't affect your energy balance. These are individual topics that do overlap, but they're not determinant of each other. So if you think, yes, if you had a calorie of chocolate and a calorie of broccoli, the broccoli is going to be probably more nutrient dense for you. Yes, so your choices in terms of food come back to your health. Eating those whole foods are going to be much more nutrient dense, so they are going to be better for your health, but ultimately a calorie of each is only going to be a calorie of each. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the biggest thing you want to be looking for is if you're trying to lose weight, is looking for a deficit. The most sustainable I found is around about the 15% mark. So if we take that 3100 that I am for maintenance, if I was looking to shed a little bit of body fat, what I would be doing is then I'm bringing down that 15% deficit, which would bring me to 2633.2, 2630 calories for a rough benchmark. If I consistently eat at that, I will make steady weight loss as I go. Now, one thing I want to highlight as well is the difference between weight loss and fat loss. Is on particularly restrictive diets, you can lose an awful lot of weight, but you tend to lose more muscle as well. This was highlighted by a study in 2011 where they had people doing a 500 calorie deficit for 9 weeks and a 790 calorie deficit for 5 weeks. The two groups lost the same total weight, but the 500 calories for 9 weeks lost more fat and gained muscle, whereas the 790 calories for 5 weeks, short time period, lost less fat but also lost muscle. So it depends again, as much as fast gains in weight loss sounds great, it does come with its drawbacks as well. One thing I've always encouraged and I will always encourage is, remember, we're thinking about a marathon, not a sprint here. You're going to be in a better position once you have lost that fat if you are doing it in a more sustainable approach where you can maintain or possibly even gain some muscle as you go through that process as well. The end point you'll be in is going to be better than if you just try and drop as much weight as possible really quickly. Most diets and most nutrition plans that you find out there tend to be built around some sort of overeating prevention. So this is, if you think intermittent fasting, you're just shortening the window you're going to eat in. It means that you generally eat less. So hence the calorie deficit, where you then end up losing more weight. There is no specific diet that is the best. It's an individual thing. This was found in a systematic review that was done a couple of years ago now, actually. There's common diets like Atkins, fasting, all sorts like that, where actually they found that it didn't matter necessarily which diet people were on. What mattered most was that they adhered to the diet. So whatever nutrition plan you put in place that you can sustain, that's the one you should stick with. Just because your friend's doing keto and it's working for them doesn't mean it's going to work for you. It's about what actually works for you. What can you fit with your lifestyle? What's sustainable as you go? And ultimately, it all comes down to being in that calorie deficit. One thing I'll say as well that I hinted at there along the way is that actually we want to try and prevent as much muscle loss as possible, unless, again, we go back to the exceptions that I mentioned earlier. If you just need to lose as much weight as possible so that they can get you on the operating table and actually do your op, then yes, don't worry so much about losing the muscle, I guess, because you're on a timeline there and you've got to lose the weight. But if you're looking to actually leave yourself in a healthier position, a stronger position by the time you finish that nutrition, we want to still prevent a little bit of that muscle loss. Two of the main factors of that is going to be maintaining some form of weight training as you go, whatever you were doing previously to build muscle, or if you weren't doing anything, starting doing something to build muscle. will always help with maintaining that muscle as you go through. And then the other one, in terms of more nutrition itself, is making sure that you keep a nice high protein intake. There's a little bit of variation on this when you look at the literature, but the most common range that you found that tends to lead to success is about 1.6 to 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So in alternative money, that's about 0.7 to 1 gram per pound. Good, then the last one, talking about muscle gain itself, you can actually still gain muscle when you're in a calorie deficit, particularly if you're either untrained or if you're new to training. So if you were previously training and you'd stopped for a long period of time and then you start training again, you can still build muscle from there, and I can dive into a little bit more about how you actually do that in a later video in terms of recomposition along the way. If you're brand new to weight training, you can still be in a deficit, and just because of what we call the newbie gains, because it's a huge change in stimulus to adapt to, you will still get the muscle protein synthesis response, that you will still gain muscle from that without being in a calorie surplus. For anyone else that's maybe doing a little bit of training already, doesn't want to look to put on too much body fat, what you can do is just look for a small calorie surplus. So we're looking around about the 10% mark. I found works best, but you can actually be on slightly less than that as well. That 10% mark, if we go back to me being on 3100 to maintain, if I was looking to put on a little bit of muscle, that 10% increase brings me up to 3407.6, 3400 to round it to simple numbers. But again, like we mentioned before, the calorie tracking itself isn't super accurate, so we're working on benchmarks. 10 calories here or there is too precise for what we can actually measure. Again, like I was saying about avoiding muscle loss when you're in a deficit for actually training, if you're wanting to build muscle, you definitely need to be eating a high protein intake. The reason for that is we need to be on a high protein intake for when you've got the new adaptations that are being made by the body. That's the building blocks it used to actually create that growth. It's very similar to the muscle loss in terms of the guideline for protein intake. There is some small fluctuations in terms of the guidelines they use, but that's a really good benchmark to start off with. You can also adjust that as you go. These are guidelines. There is no specific perfect answer. It's going to be specific to the individual at the end of the day. So you can tweak and manipulate these things as you go, depending on how you're feeling, the progress you're seeing as you're going. If you're finding that you're not putting on enough muscle, well, obviously then look at my videos on volume and progression, where you can actually see whether your training is adequate. But in terms of your nutrition, maybe you do need to bring up the protein intake a little, or bring up the calories a touch as well. If you're eating a huge deficit and then you're still trying to build muscle, then it's going to be a touch more challenging if you're already a trained or experienced lifter. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you've got any questions, drop them down in the comments below. I'll try and get back to you there. Leave a like on the video. Any suggestions for new topics as well, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.